Thank you.
I don't probably need it on.
Appreciate it.
Oh, wonderful.
I was,
Thanks. I don't know how long this is. My friend, I'm doing this for the first time, so.
me too.
Amy, we're all.
Yeah. Are we doing this, are one of us going first, or how are we doing this?
Well, I'm looking over this, I'm going to be asking you questions.
Oh, you are? Okay.
Yeah, and she's going to do the recording.
Okay, I got you. It's all clear. I didn't know if you were the one doing the interviewing or...
She's doing the recording. I'm just basically going to, state your name, address,
I got to show you one picture real quick.
Oh.
You're talking about, you have a gray hair because of 2 daughters?
Oh my gosh. Are those all yours?
Yeah, with the same wife.
Holy
1 boy and 6
cow.
girls.
Oh, gee.
Oh my God.
So as you can imagine,
And you're still saying
my wife dyes her hair as well.
Wow.
Yeah,
Oh, what a handful that's got to
Oh
be.
my gosh. I thought 2-year-old was bad. I can't even
And
imagine.
before we start, I'll just give you I don't know if you read any of this, but just, where you were born, just, background information, your service, branch of service, stuff like that. Any wartime experience, there's some, and coming home, and any reflections you have about the war. Basically, that's the kind of questions we're going to. We'll just start from your basically your information, your growing up, and your family, and siblings, if you have any brothers or sisters, or stuff like that. All right. And then we'll go into your service, branch of service, boot camp, stuff like that. And then just take us if you've served in any war experience, your experiences, and if you want to share them.
Sure.
It's up to you. I mean, from what I understand, we got to talk for half an hour.
Okay.
Minimum.
Yeah, let's check the time.
That's the minimum. So
No problem.
A quarter till.
Okay.
I think it's my.
So, like I said, this is the first time I'm doing this, and,
Oh, sure.
well,
Your pins are all backed up, aren't they? They're not off of your...
one of them is.
Okay.
Nope, they're on there. Yeah.
Okay.
Not me.
I can always use extras. Somebody, they must have fallen off of emblem sales and table or something. Sorry.
Nope, no problem.
How do they train you not to laugh, by the way? Because I sat through a deposition once about 10 years ago. And it was like probably 4 hours. And it was what it was. I was a sales rep for a company, and one of our customers was suing the company, and it was my account. But I got a lot of coaching from this really good attorney, and I sat in this.
Stephenson?
Yeah, and I sat in this deposition, and then I was really getting kind of bored, and so I would say something, and the stenographer, which was a guy, he's like trying not to.
Yeah.
And don't you hear some weird stuff sometimes, and you're like, especially in the legal field.
Are you still affiliated with any of the Legion or anybody?
I'm a Legion member of Post 501 in Woodbury, Minnesota. I'm a vendor here, though.
Yeah, I know.
Here, yeah. But I am a Legion member.
521, right?
501. 501 is the post number in Minnesota.
You hold any offices there? Or?
No.
Okay. But I'm going to just basically start off, introduce myself and the date and time. And then
Thanks a lot.
we're going to ask you to take your name, full name and address, and where you reside and stuff like that. Okay? Okay.
All right, we can begin.
Could you hold me, please?
That was about good timing. Where's that coming from?
In there, probably. They're probably checking their microphones. Does that mess up the...
Yeah, well, it's just...
Background noise for her.
Pretty good music for a military interview.
You speak loud.
It's up to you guys. It doesn't bother me.
I mean, you're the one ultimately that's got to...
Let's try it.
You know what? Let me see if we can... So the voices will be recorded, but you're also...
Yeah, okay. It'll come up here on my screen in English in real time.
Okay.
Sometimes I just bring my laptop and I hook it up to my laptop and I listen up in real time. And it just makes it easier.
How much pressure is on you to get things right? I mean, it's pretty important stuff.
Yeah, I mean, if it's like a really...
Well, they just finished, so... And like I said, I think they're just testing stuff, not playing.
We can try it.
Okay.
And maybe the next one we'll see how it goes. If I'm having a hard time, I'll stop and we can...
there's an outlet out there, and
Okay.
hold the table
Is that
lower.
outdoors?
No, there's a the hallway, it's the entrance, main
I
entrance.
see.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. All right.
Okay, good morning. Today is July 10th, 2014. My name is John Charos Jr. I'm conducting an oral history interview at the Department of Illinois American Legion Convention in Springfield, Illinois, and I'm interviewing Bob Stephenson, who is a member of American Legion Post 501 in Woodbury, Minnesota. Please state your name and address for the record.
Robert Louis Stephenson Jr., 3056 Copper Oaks Circle in Woodbury, Minnesota, 55125.
There we go. Okay, Bob. Basically, we're going to go through a biographical background. Where and when were you born?
I was born in Panama City in the Republic of Panama.
Wow. And your parents and their occupation?
Well, my father, who's now deceased, was a piano tuner. My mother is, retired and used to work for the federal government in a couple different capacities, most recently the IRS. My father was an enlisted man in the Army, which took him to Panama, where he met my mother, who's Panamanian. And then he married her, and my sister and I were born in Panama.
I've been a vacation in Costa Rica last. I've been going down there for
Okay,
25 years.
sure.
Yeah. So, and do you have any brothers or sisters?
I have one sister, a year older,
And her name is?
Anne.
And any other, did they serve in the military?
Just my father.
Okay.
One tour as an Army enlisted man in the immediately following Korea in the early 50s.
And what were you doing before you entered the service?
Well, I was in college. I entered the Marine Corps Platoon Leaders Class program my sophomore year in college. So I went to OCS the summer after my sophomore year, and again the summer after my junior year. And the day after I graduated from college, I was commissioned a second lieutenant in the Marine Corps.
Oh.
June 4th, 1983.
That was going to be my next question. When you entered the military, did obviously you did an enlistment through college, right?
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct.
And so your branch was already chosen for you.
Well, I don't know, as far as, by the way, how much do you want me to ramble about?
Your Honor,
Okay.
talk about your things as much as you want to talk about.
Yeah.
So, I mean,
I never had an inkling to join the military. I never had a recruiter call me when I was in high school.
Right.
My sophomore year in college, a couple of guys moved onto my floor that were freshmen, and they had been to Marine boot camp, and they were enlisted reservists.
Oh, okay.
They told stories, they wore their camouflage trousers, they were grunting and calling cadence, and it was very intriguing to me, their military service. So then one of these guys, who's one of my best friends to this day, his name's Dale Knutson, he explained to me the Marine Corps' PLC program.
What is PLC?
Platoon Leaders Class,
Okay.
which I said before.
Okay.
And that you could sign up, go to OCS, and then up until that, before you graduate from college, you could actually drop from the program if you didn't want to do it. But so I got intrigued by that, and so I walked up to the officer recruiter on campus when they were set up at a table, and I said, I want to go to OCS this summer. And he looked at me kind of funny, because normally it's a little bit of a sales pitch for them, but I walked up and said, send me, I want to go to OCS. And I already had been briefed on it, I knew where it was, and so I was standing there telling him that in April of 1981, and then he said, well, you can go to OCS the first half of the summer or the second half of the summer. And I said, well, I'd rather go the first half, which would be in June, mid-June. And he said, if you're serious, and I didn't know anything about the federal government, I thought you could just walk up, fill out some paperwork, and go the next day, but as we know, it's not quite like that. He goes, if you're serious, this is like a Thursday in April, He said, if you're serious, you need to be in my office in Minneapolis on Monday morning. And so we made an appointment, and I went up there, and they had to kind of scramble and get paperwork done to get me to go to that first increment of training, which I did. Once I went to OCS and came back from the PLC juniors course, I had decided then that I wanted to be a Marine officer. Up until that point, I was a undecided major, and I really didn't know what I wanted to do after I graduated from college. And once I had been to OCS, I knew I wanted to be a Marine officer.
What did you have to do while you were in OCS? Or what type of classes or training?
It's all of the above. OCS is kind of like boot camp. However, the difference is Marine enlisted boot camp is they take an individual and they train him to be a Marine. Okay? OCS does not train young men to be and women to be officers. It actually screens and evaluates them for leadership capabilities. So you're still, they shave your head, you're doing a lot of field work, a lot of close order drill, a lot of PT, obstacle courses, all that stuff, a lot of classroom stuff. However, the whole time you're being evaluated as a leader. And then, and so it's similar to boot camp in that.
But you still have to go to boot camp though?
No. Officers don't go to boot camp, they go to OCS.
Okay.
And again, OCS is like boot camp in a sense, but it was an emphasis on leadership evaluation. Leadership potential evaluation.
So it's basically more of a classroom type deal versus the actual...
I would say that the time spent in the classroom and the time spent in the field or on the drill on the parade deck it's about half. It's a lot of outdoor leadership exercises.
What did they have you, when they rated you when you were in these classes, did you do what type of drills did you do, or can you explain what?
Well, everything that you'll eventually end up having your Marines do as a Marine officer, which is, close order drill, physical training such as endurance runs, obstacle courses, calisthenics, a lot of the classroom sessions centered on Marine Corps operations, philosophy, history, customs and traditions, etc.
I mean, you see in the movies where they get yelled at and, whittled and berated. Did you have to go through?
Yeah, we did that. We were in squad bays of 50 plus guys in a squad bay, not like a dorm room. We were, double bunks all the way down the hallway. You're getting woken up at 5 in the morning with trash can lids. And we stood inspection, uniform inspection, weapons inspections, junk on the bunk inspections. That's all your gear laid out on your bed. Junk on the bunk. Yeah, foot locker, wall locker, all that. Same type of stuff.
Do you remember any of your names of your instructors or anybody that you had?
My platoon sergeant that summer was Gunnery Sergeant Robinson, and the sergeant instructor was Sergeant Wilson.
Do you remember anything specific about them as far as, did they treat you decent, or were they,
Well, they fulfilled the same role as a drill instructor does at boot camp.
Yeah.
The following summer at PLC Seniors, it was Gunnery Sergeant Washington, and his instructor, our sergeant instructor was, Turner. It actually was a corporal, but acting as a sergeant instructor.
Do you remember any guys you went through the classes with? Or?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. There's a lot, one of the guys...
stand out, or you...
Well, one of the guys that I went through OCS with was Mike Rocco, who is now a two-star general in the Marine Corps and commands the 3rd Marine Aircraft Wing out on the West Coast, so some famous, some of us not so famous. By the way, quick time out, I was going to say we're spending a lot of time on early on.
That's fine.
I was in the Marine Corps for 28 years and all that, so I'm just saying...
No,
this is... Yeah, no, so you're doing the interview, but I was just kind of like, wow, if we're going to go into this much depth, and I haven't even been commissioned yet at this point. We might be here for 4 hours, so just throwing that out there.
Well, this is your story to tell.
Yeah.
So how much you want to talk about, we'll talk about it. That's, you know.
You do the questions all...
You know, I would just,
All custom-
I just
yeah.
basically, if you want to, go on from there, we're just looking for, any, does anything stand out as far as practical jokes or tricks or stuff that went on?
That's good stuff.
The banter that went on between, the enlisted guys and, and your superiors. I was a fireman for 32 years.
Oh, were you?
So I know what your firehouse strengths and,
Very similar,
and
very
I'm sure the military, if anything stands out during that time that, anything funny happened or how was the food, they want to know,
Right.
how you're treated. I mean, did you get,
So to kind of sum up my OCS experience, one of the things the Marine Corps does is they don't want any Marine officers that don't want to be there. So they give you a full opportunity to quit the program or DOR, disenroll on request.
ring the bell like on the,
Well, yeah, I'm talking more like, let's say you finish the 6 weeks, the PLC juniors course, the first 6 weeks. You go back to college. So I went back to college my junior year, and at any time I could then quit. There was no weekend drills, no meetings, nothing. You just have to stay in college and get good grades, but I could have quit at any time. And then you go back to OCS for another 6 weeks. And there's a lot of guys who say, you know what, I went to boot camp, there's no way I would go back to that place. Or there's a couple of different programs for Marine officers to become commissioned, and there's one program where you go to OCS once for 10 weeks. A lot of those guys say, I can't imagine going back for another dose of that. So I went twice for 6 weeks. But I remember being totally immersed in Marine Corps culture, at a young age, getting very gung-ho, very motivated to, the Marine Corps does a good job. Some people call it brainwashing. You could call it that. Some of our brains are dirty and need a little washing. But anyway, indoctrination, if you will. But essentially, motivation. And when you learn the history of the Marine Corps, of those that went before us, and then you learn about World War II, places like Iwo Jima, Okinawa, in World War I, the Battle of Belleau Wood in France, and Korea, Vietnam, everything. You learn all this history, and you realize that, wow, I am being given the privilege of joining an elite warrior community. And I was really humbled and honored to be, wow, they're going to give me the opportunity, provided I satisfactorily complete my training, to wear the same emblem that these previous heroes had. It's really quite moving when you think about it. And I think about that all the time when I think about my service in the Marine Corps. It's almost like if you were a baseball player and you got a chance to be on a New York Yankees. Yeah, exactly. Even though you're in the bullpen and all you do is catch relief pitchers in the bullpen and you never step on the diamond, you're wearing the New York Yankees logo, and it's very much like that.
Yeah.
So that's what I remember about OCS. That, and just the fact that I really felt that I was really part of something big and something important in American history.
So when you came out of that, you were commissioned as an officer?
Well, I went to the PLC seniors course the summer between junior and senior year of college, went back to my senior year of college, and then I graduated from college on June 3rd, and then 1983, and then the next day, June 4th, I was commissioned second lieutenant in the Marine Corps. And then, now you get into a hopper where you wait to go on active duty and begin your service, and for me, that wasn't until mid-August.
When you were in that time waiting, were you at home?
I was. Yeah. It's funny, I picked up a couple spare jobs. So here I had a bachelor's degree, and I was an officer in the Marine Corps, and I was working at a liquor store in Minneapolis, where I was just stocking shelves and carrying beer out to cars for ladies, and then I had another job as a shop assistant and parts runner at a transmission shop. And the guy who owned that transmission shop was a former Marine corporal, did one tour as an enlisted guy, and he would tell me to sweep the floor and call me sir at the same time, because I was an officer in the Marine Corps, but I had a couple of part-time jobs that summer. But I was really chomping at the bit to get in the Marine Corps. And the first thing Marine officers do when they get commissioned is and this is something different about the Marine Corps than the other branches, all Marine officers go to a 6-month course called the Basic School, TBS. And what's funny about that is that people always ask, well, oh, TBS, what does the T stand for? And we say, it stands for the. And they look at you and go, no way. Yep, doesn't stand for tactical, doesn't stand for training, it stands for the. And we have a good laugh about that. And of course, the basic school, or TBS, we have a bunch of other pet names for it, like the bad summer, the big suck, the big sleep, thousands being stupid, taxes being squandered. There's all kinds of... one thing about the Marine Corps, there's no shortage of wry and dry humor.
Oh, right.
Cynical and sarcastic, and it helps pass the time. When you're in the business of doing the nation's defense, it's always good to have people around you with a sense of humor. But anyway,
How many guys are, as far as go to that class?
about 250.
And you all meet at the same, you're all in the same room, you're all...
And now we're commissioned officers. We're living in like a dorm. I had a roommate who was another second lieutenant. It was considered a gentleman's course in the sense that, even though we had things at night sometimes, typically we were done by around 6 p.m., where you could go into town and go to a restaurant, get a couple beers or whatever, and then you had to be in formation the next morning. Yeah, you had to be in formation the next morning. And then you had your weekends off, but there was still a lot of field time. We were in the field a lot. We were in classrooms a lot, learning. And then what the mission of the basic school is to form and to train Marine officers for service. And this is before you go to your specialty school. And again, this is the part that separates the Marine Corps from the other services, is that all Marine officers go to the basic school.
Okay.
And the basic school has a heavy emphasis on infantry, which is the backbone of the Marine Corps. It's the main... the Marine Corps is really an infantry with a bunch of peripheral other units around it supporting the infantry. So basically, we used to say you go to TBS and you get a major in infantry, and then you get a minor and and everything else the Marine Corps does. Because you had a short course on artillery, armor, logistics, supply, aviation, etc. So you get a lot of infantry, a little bit of everything else, and then from there, Marine officers go to their MOS, or military occupational specialty training. For me, it was flight school. Artillery officers went to the Army's artillery officer basic course at Fort Sill, Oklahoma. Armor officers went to the Army school at Fort Knox.
What was your school at?
Pensacola, Florida. I was slotted. That was another thing that when I was in college, when I walked up to that officer recruiter and said, I'd like to go to OCS, he then said, do you want to be a pilot? And I said, well, I don't know.
I was just going to say, how did you choose?
The Marine Corps,
Did they use the force, or did they...
the Marine Corps at that time, and this kind of happens on and off throughout history.
What year would that be about?
What's that? No.
When you got to Pensacola?
Well, I went down there in, I started TBS in August of '83. We graduated in February of '84, and I reported down to Pensacola in March of '85. I'm sorry, March of '84. But when I was in college joining, they said, do you want to be a pilot? And I said, well, I don't know. I guess I knew the Marine Corps had aircraft, and pilots, but I wasn't thinking of that. I just wanted to go check out the Marine Corps officer program, and I didn't really know. And I said, well, what does that mean? He said, well, if you tell us you want to be a pilot, we give you an extra physical, a flight physical, which is a little more in depth, and you have to take another written exam that tests your aptitude to be a pilot. And if you pass those, we will actually guarantee you a slot to go to flight school. We don't guarantee you to be a pilot because you have to make it through the training, but you have a slot. So I said, sure, I'll do that. I asked my dad. My dad said to me, why don't you tell him yes on the aviation thing, because it'll be easier for you to have a pilot slot and then drop it rather than not have the pilot slot and then later decide you want to be a pilot and then have to fight for that slot. And I said, okay. So I told him yes. I took the extra exam and had the flight physical, and I passed, and ended up... So when I went to OCS and TBS, I was slotted to go to flight school, which I did. Again, I reported down there in March of '84.
And that lasted for...
Well, for me it was about a year and a half total, but there's phases of training, and then you always will get, they call it being in a pool, not a swimming pool, but a pool as in like you're And we also, the other nickname for it was being stashed. If you finish a phase of training, and then the Marine Corps or the Navy is not prepared to put you to start you in the next phase, you kind of just wait around. And they call it being stashed or being in a pool. And so I had pools in between, short pools of time in between phases of flight training. And the training itself probably would, if I did it all straight through, would have been about a year long for helicopters. Because you had to wait? But because I had to wait here and there, it ended up being about a year and a half. So flight school, and a lot of people think that all pilots train in Pensacola. That's only kind of true. Pensacola, Florida is the headquarters of the flight school, and there's a Marine unit down there called MATSIG, which is an acronym, MATSG, Marine Aviation Training Support Group. It's now called MATSG 21, but back then it was just MATSG. So in other words, you're on a Navy base, but there's a little Marine Corps administrative headquarters there for you to report to give them your record book. They maintain your records and your pay and all that sort of administrative stuff while you're there. So Marine officers go down to Pensacola, they check into MATSIG or MATSG, and then the first thing we did was something called AI, or Aviation Indoctrination. 6 weeks long, right at Naval Air Station Pensacola. A lot of classroom instruction involving engineering, physics, and navigation, and then a lot of physical activity. A lot of running, obstacle courses, swimming, and boxing, actually. They don't do that anymore, but they used to make you had to box. Boxing or with the stick that you... No, you're thinking of pugil sticks, P-U-G-I-L, pugil sticks. Yeah. This is actually boxing, in a ring with gloves on, and the Navy at some point had decided that if they taught you to box, it taught you a little bit of aggressiveness, being physical and mental at the same time, and they thought that those were attributes that you could use later being a pilot in the Navy or the Marine Corps. I personally agree with that. They have since done away with it. I don't know why, but they don't box anymore at flight school. But we did, and then we also had a fairly in-depth land survival course, a water survival course, and that was 6 weeks long. Once we were done with aviation indoctrination, then we went to primary flight training. Then we actually went to another Naval Air Station about 30 miles outside of Pensacola called Naval Air Station Whiting Field, W-H-I-T-I-N-G. Ever heard of it? And that's where the Navy, and actually, so the Navy and Marine Corps and Coast Guard, their primary flight training is either at NAS Whiting or NAS Corpus Christi in Texas. They don't actually do it at Pensacola anymore. Pensacola is proper. So I went up to Whiting Field, went through primary, which is about 6 months long. You fly the T-34C. Now it's a different aircraft now, but back then it was a T-34C.
So it's a jet.
It's actually a turboprop. Okay. Trainer, fixed wing.
All right.
And you fly that aircraft for about 6 months. Your 14th flight is a solo. You learn navigation, instruments, aerobatics, formation, and at the end of that, primary flight training is when you put in a selection, a preference for jets or helicopters or what they call maritime. Maritime is the term they used for the Marine Corps. It really meant C-130.
Oh, okay.
That was the only maritime aircraft. Yeah, and then maritime in the Navy meant E-6, which is a Boeing 707 with a military configuration, C-130, P-3, and but again, for the Marine Corps, it really meant the only maritime platform the Marine Corps has is the C-130 Hercules. So again, you're done with primary training, then you tell the Marine Corps, I want to fly jets, helicopters, or maritime. And just about everybody puts jets as their first choice. However, the Marine Corps obviously can't accommodate everybody. So how do they elect? Yeah, so basically the process is they consider 3 factors. One is your desire, and these aren't any, actually the most important thing is the needs of the Marine Corps. Okay, you want to fly jets? Okay, pal, so does everybody else. Guess what? We need helicopter pilots. You're going to be a helicopter pilot. So, but again, it's needs of the Marine Corps, and then your performance in primary flight school. So they factor in your grade. So let's say you and I both want to fly jets, and your grades are better than mine. Well, you get and there's only one jet slot, you get it because you finished higher than I did in primary. Every written exam and every flight was evaluated, and you got a grade on it. And every written exam in ground school was evaluated, and you got a grade on it. And that's how they determine your standing. So again, the three factors are the needs of the Marine Corps, your performance in primary flight training, and your desire, which is the third and bottom of the bottom priority.
And you got?
And I got helicopters.
Your first preference was jets, I take it, though, right?
Yeah. Well, like everybody puts jets first. So anyway, I had up to that point. I will say this about myself and my career. I was one of those guys who looked around, and most of the guys that I served with in the Marine Corps as officers were smarter than I was. To this day I look back and I feel blessed and lucky to have ever even made it through flight school. I had friends that were really intelligent, very good, some of these guys had flown. They had flown before. They already had a private pilot license, and they could talk on the radios, they could navigate, they knew all that. I felt like I was always trying to catch up and stay and just kind of, stay there. And some of these guys had really high expectations of themselves, and were like, I'm going to get through this no problem. I was one of those guys who was always like, wow, I can't even believe I'm here. Navy flight school, and when I say Navy flight school, the Marine Corps trains the Navy, so this applies to Navy and Marine Corps. Navy and Marine Corps flight training is designed for a liberal arts major who got a 3.0 or less in college, but who has the aptitude and the desire, and basically is willing to work their ass off to get through flight school. That's what it's designed for. A lot of people think that, to get through Navy flight school, you have to be a combination of Albert Einstein and Johnny Weissmuller. And that's actually not true. That helps, obviously, but it's designed for, again, 3.0 liberal arts, political science or history major, that who's willing to work their butt off to get through the training. So anyway, so I guess what I'm saying is that when I was in primary flight training, I just had a gut feeling, you know what, I'm going to probably end up in helicopters. Let's be real here. At the end of the day, when I looked in the mirror, and I thought, well, that's probably where. So when again, everybody puts jets first, but I really didn't have a lot of confidence I was going to get. Now, the other thing about naval aviation training is it's very cyclic. I mean, you talk to guys, I would talk to guys who every week the selection process was different. When I went through primary flight training, every week they selected 7 Marine officers, and they had, on average, while I was there was 1 jet slot out of the 7. So 7 guys would select, 1 would go jet, the rest would mostly go helicopters, and occasionally 1 guy would go maritime, here and there.
And they were told where they were going.
Yeah.
You didn't have a choice, basically. You were told that you didn't make a choice.
Right. And so what I'm saying is that when I went through, it was about 1 out of 7. I talked to guys who went through flight school 2 years after I did that said, every week, 4 out of 7 guys were getting jets. There happened to be a draft on for jets when they went through. It just depends.
Right, yeah.
And so what that means is that you could have selected, let's say a guy finishes 2nd out of 7, but there's only 1 jet slot. He's flying helicopters. 4 months later, another guy goes through with lower grades, is ranked 4th out of 7, and ends up in jets. So you can't look at the population of Marine aviators and say, he's flying F-18s, he had higher grades, and is smarter and better looking and dances better than that guy who's flying helicopters. Big kids. Yeah. So, but the military is full of instances like that in every area, not just aviation. So, then I went to an intermediate and advanced training, stayed right at NAF Whiting Field, Naval Air Station NAF Whiting Field, and ended up flying helicopters, and I got my wings in September of 1985.
What type of helicopter did you train in?
We trained in the Bell Jet Ranger, the Bell 206. That's the civilian designator. The Navy called it a PH-57. But it's basically a Bell Jet Ranger, which is a very common helicopter. A lot of law enforcement departments use it, a lot of news and weather.
But the bubble, right?
No, you're thinking of, that's actually one that the Army uses. The Marine Corps never, I think that's a Robinson helicopter that you're thinking about. We don't, no bubble on this one, but if I showed you a picture of it, you'd say, oh yeah, I know that helicopter. But then I got my wings, and then what happens is the way the Marine Corps determines what you fly, what your specialty aircraft is right before you get your wings, you put in a preference for your aircraft community, meaning the aircraft type, and east or west coast. And I wanted to fly AH-1 Cobras on the west coast, so I put that as my first choice, and I got lucky and I got it. And I found that out right before I got my wings. You put in and again, they look at needs of the Marine Corps, how you did, or your grades in flight school, and your desire. And if they can match up your desires with their needs, great. If not,
Did anybody come through with you from schooling, or did you have to maintain any, did any of the guys that were in your college classes, did they come with you? Did you have anybody throughout your whole years of service that you stayed, followed you with you, or, came through the same schooling, or stayed in the same classes, or?
yes, there were guys that, I can look back now, someone will say, do you know so-and-so?
Yeah.
I can say, yes, I went to OCS with him, or I went to TBS with him, or I went through flight school with him. Now, some of those guys, well, I didn't go through OCS with them, but I went to TBS and flight school with them, or you went through all three of them, so it kind of just depends. Yeah. But I do have friends that I went through all phases of training with.
Do you stay in touch with them at all, or?
Yeah. Social media has helped that out a lot.
Yeah.
Some good friends you stay in touch with.
Were you
throughout all of it. Now, with social media, you end up getting in touch with people that you haven't talked to for 20 years. And that's whether it's LinkedIn or Facebook.
So after graduating and going to the West Coast, continue.
Yeah. So
you did a great job.
Anyway, by the way, I had so I got orders to go to now in marine aviation, once you determine what aircraft you're going to fly, they send you what's called a RAG, which is an acronym. And I think RAG is a nickname. It's for a while I think they called them Fleet Replacement Squadrons. I think RAG stood for Replacement Air Group, if I'm not mistaken. But it was slang. But the RAG is a squadron that trains you to fly a specific aircraft. So in the Marine Corps, there's a AH-1 RAG, there's an F-18 RAG, a CH-46 RAG, for example, and the Cobra RAG, or AH-1 RAG. The AH-1 is the Cobra. It's at Camp Pendleton, California. And so I had orders to go there, go to the RAG, which is HMT 303, and get trained to fly the Cobra, which I did. And that was I reported there in very late November of 1985.
Wow.
And I finished the RAG in March of 86. And then I went to when you go to an operational squadron, they call it either a fleet squadron or a gun squadron. And a gun squadron is typically used in the attack and fighter community. Aircraft that actually have weapons on them. So you say, well, what gun squadron were you in? Or what fleet squadron were you in? For me, that was HMLA 169. The world famous Viper. That was our squadron nickname. And that was right at Camp Pendleton also. So I went to the RAG at Camp Pendleton, and I went to my operational fleet squadron there. And I was there from March of 86 through
he's on a roll.
Thank you.
He's doing very good, I think.
And so I'm not ready to yell Freebird, but I was in HML 169 from March of 86 through December of 88. And at which time, and now during the roughly 3 years of being in HMLA 169, I made one deployment. Now, in marine aviation, kind of the quintessential or normal career, you go to an operational unit and then you make a deployment. Now, in the last, 10, 12 years, that has been Afghanistan or Iraq. But during the peacetime Marine Corps in the 80s that when I was at Camp Pendleton, it meant if you were an East Coast Marine, you would do either a Mediterranean cruise or a Med cruise or a NATO cruise, they call it, in the North Atlantic Sea. And then what that means is you're deployed aboard Navy ships. Operational Marine units deployed aboard Navy ships. On the West Coast, there was always a WestPac or a Western Pacific. Basically, you get on a ship out of either Long Beach or San Diego. And they do those operations with drills, wherever. Right. You do some workups before you deploy, but essentially, you deploy on ship. And in our case, it was amphibious. The Navy ship is called an amphibious ready group. And it's 3 ships. And they're called amphibious ships because, the Navy has a multitude of different ships, whether they have destroyers, battleships, and cruisers and frigates. Amphibious ships, their whole purpose or mission is just to give Marines a ride to conflict. And so, the ship, so it was an amphibious ready group. The flagship was the USS Peleliu, T-E-L-E-L-I-U. USS Peleliu, which is LHA-5. That's the home number. It's I think it stands for landing helicopter assault or amphibious, I don't know. LHA-5, USS Peleliu. And she was based out of Long Beach. And then the other 2 ships that were with her in the amphibious ready group were the USS Fort Fisher and the USS Denver. And the Denver was called an LPD. Now this is bad, but I can't remember if the Fort Fisher, I could probably look it up on my smartphone, but I'm going to go Fort Fisher was either an LSD or an LST. But the Denver was an LPD 9. And essentially you've got several thousand Marines in a unit called a Marine Expeditionary Unit. And it has an infantry battalion landing team, a composite squadron of 4 different types of helicopters, and the associated support people, we call them cooks, bakers, and candlestick makers. But essentially there's a logistics unit that supports that infantry and aviation unit. And they integrate this whole thing and put it on 3 Navy ships. And we left Long Beach in January of 1988 and floated around the Western Pacific for 6 months and came back in July of 1988. And so they called that WestPac or Western Pacific 88-1 because it was the first half of 1988.
So, can you describe your life being on board a ship? Or?
Sure. And one more thing about the Marine Corps unit, though. The way the Marine Corps, when Marines are sitting at big bases like Camp Lejeune, Lejeune, which is actually pronounced Lejeune, and Camp Pendleton on the West Coast, Camp Lejeune on the East Coast, they're actually in units that are not task organized for battle. Then what the Marine Corps does is the Marine Corps takes these units at these big bases, takes elements from different units, and puts together something called a Marine Air Ground Task Force, or MAGTAF. We call it, that's the acronym, MAGTAF. And MAGTAF come in different sizes based on what you need them for. But the 3 main MAGTAFs in the Marine Corps are Marine Expeditionary Force. A smaller unit is a Marine Expeditionary Brigade. And the smallest is the Marine Expeditionary Unit.
How many Marines are comprised in each of those? Wildcats or?
I'm going to guess that a MEU is about 3,000, but I'd have to look that up. But so the MEU is the smallest and most flexible and most nimble unit. And right now, as we sit here, there's a Marine Expeditionary Unit in the Mediterranean floating on ships. waiting to go into either Libya or Lebanon or a place like that on short notice. There's also a Marine Expeditionary Unit right now floating around the Western Pacific, ready to go into the Philippines or Malaysia or South Korea. And of course the Marine Corps has all these contingency battle plans for expected conflicts. For example, South Korea is one. The U.S. has been prepared to invade North Korea or South Korea, to defend South Korea against North Korea since the 1950s. And we've been prepared to respond to crises in the Middle East since forever. Where was I going with that? Don't put that in there, hang on.
break, let us know.
Okay.
No, I'm just trying to think for her, yeah, how you doing?
I'm doing good.
How's the fellow sitting in there? So,
something like that.
So at any given time, you've got a Marine MAGTF basically on strip alert, ready to respond to a contingency. And a lot of that as well would be disaster relief and humanitarian assistance, not just war or conflict. So again, the first half of 1988 I spent on the USS Peleliu as a Cobra pilot, and we were with the. So I was on the HMLA 169 detachment to HMM 164, which was the composite squadron. We were part of the 11th MEU, or Marine Expeditionary Unit. And then, of course, we were on the USS Peleliu as part of an amphibious ready group, which at that time was called ARG-A, or Alpha, ARG Alpha. We went to Hawaii. We went off the coast of Okinawa. We went to Guam. We went to South Korea. We went to Hong Kong. And we went to the Philippines. And that was really the area we covered.
Just stop there to replenish supplies or Liberty or...
Exactly. And then, like, for example, we went to the Philippines once for 3 weeks, where we flew our helicopters off the ship onto the Naval Air Station at QB Point, CUBI, QB Point Naval Air Station. The ship was docked at what's it called? Not Alonga Post, the town. QB Point, Subic Bay. Subic Bay, S-U-B-I-C. Subic Bay Naval Base was where the ship was parked, and we flew our helicopters off at the QB Point Naval Air Station. And we stayed for 3 weeks. But that was about the longest time we were ever ashore. When we went to Guam, it was for about a week. When we went to South Korea, the couple times we went to South Korea, it was for a few days at a time. We participated in a large exercise with the South Koreans called Team Spirit. It was an annual show of force exercise to remind the North Koreans that we were ready to join up with the South Koreans and kick their ass at any time.
So like the movie Battleship.
So then, and then we were at sea. I think the most we were at sea at one time straight without going ashore was about 3 weeks. But essentially it was a 6-month deployment or cruise, we called it. We did not go to Australia, Singapore, or Thailand, which we were told were really cool places to go, and our ship never went there. The other thing I missed out on is we never crossed the equator. There's a tradition in the Navy and the Marine Corps that when you're on a ship that crosses the equator, before doing that, you're always considered a WOG, W-O-G, and which is short for polywog, which is obviously a polywog is a junior form of amphibian life.
Low life.
Yeah, and so once you cross the equator, you become what's called a shellback. And there's this elaborate ceremony. There's an elaborate borderline hazing initiation ritual involved, and then there's an elaborate ceremony. You get an actual certificate, and it was I don't know if the Navy does this anymore, but it was entered in your record book that you were a shellback and that you crossed the equator on such and such a date. We never did. I was kind of cheated on that in my career. Never did it. Came back from that, spent more time flying Cobras at Camp Pendleton.
You guys weren't deployed anytime you were...
No, this was 1988, there was nothing
going on, or...
the only thing we ever did was, the Soviets would send, this is Cold War, the Soviets would send a large aircraft they had called a Bear, the Russian Bear, and it was a big multi-engine patrol plane, and they would fly Bears near the amphibious ready group, and we would launch, it was a little bit silly, but we actually launched Cobras with heat-seeking air-to-air missiles called AIM-9, AIM-9 Sidewinders, and as kind of a show of force, but it was, so there was a general Cold War stuff where we were on the lookout for Soviet activity, but there was never, on our deployment, there was never any conflict, going on anywhere at that time.
You never put in like a ready alert type of status or anything like that?
No, at this time, there was, if you look into history, in late 87 and in early 88, there was some hot activity on oil platforms in the Persian Gulf at that time, where the Iranians were threatening, and we had other Marines in other groups deployed in that area, and we were not involved in it. Went back to Camp Pendleton in July of 1988, and continued flying Cobras at Camp Pendleton. And one thing kind of cool I did in 1987, this was actually before the deployment I just talked about, I went to a school in Norway called the Allied Officer Winter Warfare Course, which was a 6-week school run by the Norwegian Royal Army, and it was basically Norway's gift to NATO. And the students in the course were from all different NATO countries. We had American Marines, we had American Army, we had a Dutch Royal Marine officer, we had a French officer, 2 West German officers, we had a Swiss officer, a Spanish officer, we had Danes, several Danes, and we had a lot of Brits. There were probably 22 British officers in the course, and there was, I'm trying to think if I'm forgetting it, I think I rattled off all the countries where the students came from. Within the British, there were British Army, British Royal Navy, British Royal Marines, 1 RAF officer, 2 SAS members. There was 1 Navy SEAL in the course, and it was basically, it was a fluke. Our squadron got offered a quota, and our executive officer at the time said, and it had to be somebody who could PT pretty good, like was in good shape, because there's a lot. We cross-country skied every day. We did a couple of winter biathlons while we were there, and it was in the middle of Norway in a place called Elverum. It was not above the Arctic Circle, although we went up to the Arctic Circle for field exercises, but Elverum, Elverum, Norway. And again, 6 weeks long, from January to March, the coldest time of the year, in one of the coldest countries in the year. But it was kind of an adventure, and it was fun. So fast forward back to 1988. Towards the end of 1988, I got picked to do a tour as a full air controller with an infantry battalion.
What is that?
Every Marine infantry battalion has 3 pilots on its staff. One of them is the battalion air officer, and 2 of them are forward air controllers. And the way they determine who's who is whoever happens to be senior ends up being the air officer. So in December of 1988, I reported to 3rd Battalion, 5th Marine Regiment, 1st Marine Division, at Camp Pendleton, same base that I was flying Cobras at, so I didn't have to relocate or anything. And it was a 1-year tour of duty, and I was the only aviator in the battalion when I checked in, so I became the air officer. Shortly thereafter, I was a captain at the time, 2 other captains checked in, and they were both junior to me, so they worked for me as forward air controllers. So as the battalion air officer, I was on the battalion staff, and then when we deployed or went to the field, I was in what was called the Alpha Command Group, which is...
What is your job? I mean, to be when you're in charge, what do you basically have to do?
So a Marine infantry unit always utilizes supporting arms. The supporting arms consist of basically naval gunfire, artillery, mortars, and air, meaning jets dropping bombs or Cobra helicopters shooting rockets and missiles. The battalion air officer's job is to advise the battalion commander on aviation-related matters, whether that means troop lifts with helicopters or close air support of the infantry. And so during that year as the battalion air officer, we did short, I'll call them local deployments, because typically they were in places like 29 Palms, California, which is a large desert training base in California. It was only a couple of hours away from where we were based. We went to the Marine Corps Mountain Warfare Training Center in Bridgeport, California. We went to Fort Ord, California, which was up by Monterey. It's now closed, but that was the Army base where Clint Eastwood was a lifeguard at the pool when he was in the Army, which was a long time before I was there, but that's just a little trivia about Fort Ord, California. And so I did that for a year as a battalion air officer, and that ended in, my year was up in December of '89. In the Marine Corps, as an officer, the person who decides your next career path or where you're assigned or your whatever is called a monitor, which is a guy who sits in Washington, D.C. at the Marine Corps headquarters, and then there's a monitor for helicopter pilots. And so at that time, I had told the monitor that I would like to, the air officer job, or that tour of duty with the ground unit, is considered, it's not considered a desirable tour by most aviators. In other words, pilots usually get assigned and forced to go do that. They don't choose it. Oh, okay. For me, it happened to be an excellent tour. I had a lot of fun. It was rewarding, and it helped me in my career tremendously. But the monitor had told me, he said, "You do this ground tour for me, and then I'll let you do whatever you want after that." And I said, "I would like to go to Pensacola to the Navy Flight School to be a flight instructor." And he said, "Fine." So after my tour as an air officer, he gave me orders for 3 years to go to Pensacola, back to where I had trained as a student years before as a flight instructor. And I ended up in Training Squadron 6, or VT6, as an instructor pilot in the T-34C, which is what I had trained in. So one nice thing about the way the Navy and the Marine Corps does it is, even though I was slotted to fly helicopters and I flew helicopters for my job, because I had initially trained in the T-34 years before, that allowed me to go back and be an instructor in a fixed-wing aircraft as opposed to a helicopter. At that point in my career, I had about 1,000 flight hours, mostly in helicopters. I had about 100 hours in the T-34 as a student, but then about 900 in helicopters. So I reported to Naval Air Station Whiting Field in January of 1990 and started a 3-year tour as an instructor in T-34. That was a very rewarding and enjoyable tour. I liked teaching. In fact, that might be the best job I ever had in the Marine Corps, was teaching students how to fly airplanes. And when you're an instructor, they assign you what's called an on-wing student. And here's a guy who's either a Navy ensign or a Marine second lieutenant who's never flown before. And you fly his first 8 flights. He goes off-wing or flies his next 4 flights with different instructors to get a little variety. Then he comes back to you for a couple of flights and a check ride, meaning it's like the examination from hell where you run them through the ringer, and then and they pass their check ride, then they do their first solo. And that's only their 14th flight in the aircraft. Any harrowing experiences with any? Yes. Yes. If you could talk about that, or well, So one of the most rewarding things for me as a flight instructor was to take an on-wing student who's never flown before and guide them through the process and see them go on to solo in the aircraft, and then eventually, God willing, to later complete flight training and get their wings and become a pilot, you're partially responsible for the future of marine aviation. So you had a lot of responsibility, but it was a lot of fun. The balance, every marine pilot has a ground job. While he's a pilot, he has a ground job. When I was in the Cobra Squadron at Camp Pendleton, I was the flight officer, which meant I wrote the flight schedule for other Cobra pilots in the squadron. I was the legal officer, which means I worked in the administration or S1 shop. And it seems when you're in the fleet, the balance of ground job to flying is tipped in favor of the ground job. And so you spend more time doing that than actually flying. When you're a flight instructor in the training command, it's reversed. You do very little ground job and you mainly concentrate on flying. So it was very common to fly 2 to 3 flights a day. So we show up at 7 in the morning, brief, fly, debrief, take a break. Brief, fly, debrief, take a break, and then often it'd be a third flight. So to put it in perspective, in 3 years flying Cobras at Camp Pendleton, I logged about 700 hours in 3 years. Is that considered a lot, or? No, actually, let me go back to that for a second. Let me think about this for a second. When I got my wings, I had 230 hours in the training command, and I ended up with just right at 1,000. So 770. So in 3 years, I flew 775 hours in Cobras. When I went back to the training command, I flew 1,500 hours in 3 years in a P-34. I literally flew twice as much in the training command. There's a lot of fun flying too. You have to teach cross-country navigation. So a very common thing was on weekends, you would take a student in an aircraft on a Friday and fly somewhere, and often it'd be between 3 and 6 hours away, and then you would park the aircraft on Friday night and then come back on Sunday. So you got to go hang out somewhere for the weekend, and you could pick, for example, I'm from Minnesota, and my parents lived up there. So I told, at that time I was married, I told my wife, I said, I'm not going to go on a cross country every weekend, because that'll put a strain on the marriage. Even more than just being a military. Did she live with you in Pensacola? Yeah. Okay. Yeah, we got married how'd you meet her? At college. Oh, okay. I knew my wife in college, and we got engaged while I was in flight school. All right. And we got married about 6 months after I got my wings. So when I was a new, fresh in the fleet, a Marine lieutenant flying Cobra to Camp Pendleton, we got married in July of 1986, and she joined me there. We didn't have kids for 5 years, and she was a school teacher. And then when I was a flight instructor in Pensacola, my first and my only son and my first of 7 was born in August of 91 while I was doing my flight instructor course. Ironically, that same son is now a second lieutenant in the Marine Corps stationed in Pensacola. And he lives about 2 miles from the hospital, the Naval Hospital in Pensacola, where he was born 22 years ago. And I think he's following your footsteps? He's a Marine second lieutenant, just starting flight school now. Back to the flying. It was common to go on cross-country flights. Some guys went every weekend. I told my wife that I'm going to go about every other weekend. It's a good way to rack up some flight hours and good training. So I would, I think, probably 9 times in that 3-year tour, I took a P-34 and a student from Pensacola and flew up to Minneapolis. And we spent the weekend with family and friends and then come back on Sunday and complete quality training at the same time. I flew P-34 from Pensacola to Southern California. I went to Denver. Was there any refueling involved with that? Yes. Every aircraft is limited to what we call aircraft either have long legs or short legs. The P-34 can fly about 2.5 hours. So I'll give you an example. When I went to Minneapolis, my typical route would be I would fly from Pensacola to Paducah, Kentucky, in western Kentucky. from Paducah, I would go to Mason City, Iowa, and then from Mason City, I would fly a short third leg into Minneapolis. I could fly 2 legs to most of the Air Force bases in Texas, at least in East Texas. So 1 leg from Pensacola to New Orleans, and then from New Orleans to maybe San Antonio or Dallas or Austin, something like that. I flew up to Washington, D.C. to Andrews Air Force Base several times. That typically was 2 legs. You go from Pensacola up to somewhere in South Carolina or North Carolina, and then into northern, Maryland, which is Andrews Air Force Base in Maryland, right up to D.C. Otherwise, we do a lot of local training flights. I instructed in every category. There were 9 categories that you could instruct in, and I was qualified to instruct in 8 of them. I was also qualified to teach other instructors in all 8 of those. And that was, again, a very rewarding tour. I have former on-men students of mine that became colonels in the Marine Corps and squadron commanders, and it's fun. One of my, I think I had 11 on-wing students. One of them, I'll single out, Sean Coakley, C-O-A-K-L-E-Y, Sean Coakley. He is now a colonel in the Marine Corps. He had a squadron command tour. He flew President Bush, the second President Bush. He flew, he was in the presidential helicopter squadron, which is HMX-1. So he's had a very good career. And every time we get together, he tells me, he goes, I wouldn't have made it through flight school if it wasn't for you. Because when one of my goals as a flight instructor, when I had my on-wing students, is I was determined that they would you never wanted another instructor. Once your student went off-wing and went to later phases of training, if they were a little bit sloppy with their brief or their pre-flight or their procedures, their instructor for that flight would go, who's your on-wing? Oh, it's Captain Stephenson. I never wanted another instructor to come up to me and said, hey, I flew with your guy, whatever, and he flew a lousy he was average at best, but he didn't teach me anything. So I was considered a pretty hard, I had a reputation of being very tough on my students. And whenever I'd see them in the squadron spaces, I would stop and I would quiz them on questions and I would drill them. I had a lot of fun with it. I interjected humor into it. But later on, guys told me, said, sir, when I saw you coming, I would turn around and head the other way. But I had a reputation for being really tough, and that was by design. And I had students who would come up to me later when they were in advanced training and said, hey, you were hard on me, but I never had a problem. I was never unprepared for a brief or a flight after going through you, having you as an on-wing, and that's how I wanted it. And, frankly, we're talking about life and death here. Flying military aircraft is not casual work, and it requires a high degree of concentration and precision. And I took my job as an instructor very seriously. And I said, hey, all right, look, when my students would show up for the first brief, I would say, hey, this is a lot of fun. Everybody saw Top Gun, Maverick, Goose, everything, okay? We're going to go to the Oak Club later and have a few beers, and we're going to have fun, and people think we're cool, and we think we're cool. In fact, we probably think we're cooler than we really are. But you have to be ready to do this, because when you're flying a Marine helicopter with 15 young Marines in the back of your helicopter, and if you screw something up and a couple of those guys die, and this may never happen literally, but you should be prepared to look that Marine's mother in the face and tell her, your kid is dead because I'm a screw-up. And this is serious business. So, again, back to Sean Coates. He had a great career, and he tells me every time we get together that I stay in touch with him, and I've seen him off and on over years. He said, I wouldn't have made the price of it. And I said, well, you might be exaggerating, but whatever. Thanks, I'll take that. So it's easy as an instructor to live your life vicariously through those that you train, and that reflection on you. I mean, their ultimate
based on what you see,
Right.
It's your reputation.
So that was my last active duty tour. I did 10 years active duty. I left active duty at that point. I had one son. My wife and I wanted to leave active duty and go back to home to the Midwest. I took a job as a pharmaceutical sales rep in Wisconsin, and just next door to Minnesota. It's kind of close. With Pfizer. And I left active duty after 10 years, and I went to sales. And then, and basically as a civilian, I've always worked in sales in different capacities. I joined the reserves about 6 months after I left active duty. And no, actually in Illinois, in Chicago, there's an infantry battalion in Chicago called 2nd Battalion, 24th Marine Regiment, and I joined them as a Fort Air Controller. I was in that reserve unit for 4 years, and then at some point there we kept having kids. We moved back to Minnesota, and I was in the reserve in Minnesota for a while. I was in a reserve unit in Kansas City, New Orleans. In the Marine Corps, when you I picked up major in the reserve, and then later lieutenant colonel in rank. The more senior you get, you have to go to faraway towns with big staff, and so it's not like being in the guard unit down the street anymore. And so I was in a reserve unit that was headquartered in Kansas City, later in New Orleans, and I did mobilize. I volunteered for Iraq in 2004, and I basically shopped around and found myself a job with 3rd Marine Aircraft Wing, which is headquartered in San Diego. And so I kind of threw my name in the hat for mobilization. So in September of 2004, I was mobilized, and so I got orders to report to San Diego to 3rd Marine Aircraft Wing, which I did. Within 2 weeks, I was in Kuwait and then later Iraq. This is October of 2004. My wife was pregnant with our 7th kid at the time. I went to Iraq, and again, I got there in October of 2004, and I reported to the forward headquarters of 3rd Marine Aircraft Wing at the Al-Assad Air Base, which is 2 words, AL and then ASAD, which was the large Marine Air Base it's where the Marine Air Headquarters was in Iraq. And then I further deployed forward to a forward operating base, FOB, called CALSU, A-L-S-U. And that's Al-Assad is in Anbar, western Anbar province, Al-Anbar, 2 words, A-L-A-N-B-A-R province. CALSU is in northern Babil province, B-A-B-I-L. So FOB CALSU is in northern Babil province, about 30 miles south of Baghdad, near the towns of, well, I'm not even going to say these, but basically northern Babil province, and the Marine unit occupying CALSU when I was there was the 24th Marine Expeditionary Unit. 24MEU is the abbreviation for. I was the air boss, which is a kind of a glorified name for a airfield operations officer. In civilian terms, like an airport manager. So I was the air boss at FOB CALSU, which means I was responsible for the airfield. I had 67 Marines working for me from 11 different detachments that were mainly all airfield support functions, like air traffic control, ordnance, expeditionary airfield, refueling, etc. And I was at FOB CALSU for 4 months, and at in late February of 2005, the 24th Marine Expeditionary Unit turned that FOB over to a Army National Guard unit from Mississippi called the 155th BCT, which stands for Brigade Combat Team. They took over And then I went back to Al-Assad, and where I spent about a week, and then I flew back to the U.S. with the rest of the headquarters staff of 3rd Marine Aircraft Wing. And anybody who went in and out of Iraq went through Kuwait, so that anytime you go in and out of Iraq, you spend 4 to 6 days in Kuwait in processing, out processing.
Did you any time come under any fire at all at the bases, or
Any what?
did you come under any fire from any military?
So, good question. So, the biggest threats because Operation Iraqi Freedom was interesting because we were in a country that we were occupying, but we weren't at war with. We had invaded Iraq in early 2003, and now the new Iraqi provisional government was allied with us, but we were fighting an insurgency. So we were doing what were called SASO, Security and Stability Operations. So now that insurgency, so the main threat to Marines in Iraq were IEDs, or improvised explosive devices, i.e. roadside bombs. Also, there was the direct fire threat of, for example, if you read or study about the Battle of Fallujah in November of 2004, it's a lot of house-to-house fighting. And so, what we mean by a firefight is a Marine with a rifle aiming it at a bad guy, and the bad guy has a weapon aiming it at the Marine, and they're shooting at each other. Typical, kind of more traditional combat, if you will. The third threat is what's called IDF, or indirect fire, and that's like when you're, and there wasn't any enemy artillery fire. In Iraq, it was rockets and mortars. And what basically the way that worked was insurgents from a hidden position would set up a mortar or a rocket and fire it into an American compound randomly, hoping to hit something. Their tactics and training was very poor, so they couldn't aim very well. That's both bad news and good news. So the good news is that they couldn't aim it at you, but the bad news was that they would lob rounds into the fob indiscriminately. And so again, that's called IDF is our term for it, and incoming, whatever you want to call it. And typically it was 87 millimeter mortars, which is an old Soviet mortar system, or 122 millimeter rockets. Some FOBs in Iraq got IDF way more than others. For example, I think the whole 6 months I was in Iraq, Al-Assad, the base that I had initially gone to on my way in and out, I think they took IDF maybe twice that whole time. There's a camp in near Ramadi, R-A-M-A-D-I, near Ramadi, called Blue Diamond. And it was very famous. A lot of Marine units that deployed there the whole time we were in Iraq saw a lot of action. And they took IDF as often as 3 times a day. There's also a camp called Ramadi, in the town of Ramadi, and the Camp Blue Diamond. They took IDF sometimes like 3 times a day. Where we were at Kalsu, I kept track in my calendar every time we took a mortar or rocket attack, and it ended up being about 6 times a month is all. So we would get mortared, and then you knew just statistically it might not be for a week or a week and a half. Sometimes it was 3 days later. It was a little bit random, but on average we took IDF about 6 times a month. And basically, you're sitting there and all of a sudden you hear an explosion. Sometimes it was 50 yards away, sometimes it was a quarter mile away. But then, you had to, everybody, depending on what your job was, had a procedure you had to follow, whether that was to go to a bunker. We all had our flak jackets and helmets. We didn't have to wear them all the time, but they had to be, you had to be able to have your helmet and your flak jacket on within 30 seconds. That was our base policy. And then when you were ever walking let's say you had a tent that you lived in or worked in, and you had to go to the chow hall or to a meeting, you had to wear your flak and helmet when you were transiting in between. But when you were sitting there, just worked, like where I worked in the air boss tent on the airfield, I just had to have my flak and helmet within 30 seconds of it. In the chow hall, we had to wear our flak jacket, but we did not have to wear our Kevlar helmet. Kevlar, Kevlar, it's a name for like a substance that helmets are made out of. But Marines refer to their helmet, which is made of Kevlar. They refer to it as their Kevlar. It becomes the noun that refers to their helmet. So we didn't have to have our Kevlar on, but you had to have it. It was basically in your lap or on the floor by you. So we took more IDF than a lot of FOBs, but not as much as others. Occasionally Marines would get wounded. The only Marine that worked for me that was killed in action at Kalsu was killed by a IDF attack. His name is Corporal Kyle Renehan, Renehan. He was from Pennsylvania, one of 5 boys from an Irish family, and he was born on St. Patrick's Day, 1983. And is that right? Yeah, 1983. He was an air traffic controller, and so he was one of the Marines that worked for me. And he was sitting in an internet cafe, and he was wounded in I don't remember the exact date. I have it all written down somewhere, but he was wounded in November of '04. He was basically sitting at a computer. The internet cafe was like a place where you could go and get online. And mainly guys would get online to check their email. They might go onto Yahoo Instant Messenger and talk with loved ones back home. And Kyle was sitting at a computer station in the internet cafe, and the first round of a 3-round mortar attack came into the roof of the tent and landed about 3. Let me back up. Sorry. The first round landed somewhere else on the FOB. So what most guys would do when the first round would hit, they knew another one was going to come in within a few seconds. Maybe, you got to imagine a couple of Iraqi insurgents using a mortar system. They'll lob a mortar round, and the time of flight, can be 20 to 45 seconds, depending on the trajectory and the system and all that. So you knew that once the round hit, there was another one coming in between 20 and 40 seconds later. So the best idea is to lay down or run to the bunker. And some guys would run to the bunker thinking, then I'm inside a concrete bunker. Other guys would say, I'm not running to the bunker because if it lands near me while I'm running, and if you're vertical, you have a higher chance of getting hit by shrapnel. If you're laying down, the round has to land very close to you to hurt you, because when a mortar round comes in at a certain trajectory, the frag pattern of the shrapnel sprays up and typically will miss you if you're a few feet away. Anyway, so the first round hit, and Kyle hit the deck, and then the second round landed about 3 feet from where he was laying. And he was wounded severely, and then and then a third round came in somewhere else, and then the attack was over. Kyle was taken to the Battalion Aid Station, or BAS, where he was treated initially. They call a medevac helicopter. The Army did the entire medevac mission in Iraq. So what that means is that a few minutes later, an Army Black Hawk is landing on our FOB, and they take him out on a stretcher or a litter, and they put him on, and they wheel him to what's called a CSH, or a Combat Support Hospital. We called it a CASH. It was called CASH South, and it was in the southern part of Baghdad. And so he gets airlifted on a Black Hawk, Army Black Hawk helicopter, to the CASH South, where he spent a couple of days, and he was further medevaced to, there was a large Army, or a large U.S. military medical facility in Germany at, I'm pretty sure it was at Landstuhl, Landstuhl, I think. That's how I think it's called, Landstuhl. So he was medevaced to Germany, and then his condition was such that, he might not make it. So his family was flown to Germany and was with him. He had a brother that was all deployed elsewhere in Iraq and was with him. Anyway, he died in the hospital in Germany a couple weeks later. So, and again, we had other Marines that were wounded occasionally by these indirect fire attacks. And but Kyle was one of the few that was killed in action. Very frustrating because as Marines, we consider ourselves to be tough guys, and we feel that an honorable way to fight is to look your enemy in the eye and declare your intentions. And fighting an insurgency, like we did in Iraq, was frustrating because we considered the Iraqi insurgents to be cowardly and to use tactics that were not honorable, and that's why they call it terrorism. Roadside bombs, indirect fire attacks where you're just indiscriminately lobbing mortar rounds into a compound hoping that you hit something. And so it's very frustrating to sit there and take pot shots. This is the best way to put it.
Basically sitting ducks.
Right, and we would launch a quick reaction force or a CRF to try to get the guys that were shooting at us, and but, more often than not, we couldn't cover the whole area. And typically, the way the Iraqi insurgents would work is they would pull up, look around, not see an American patrol, and you're talking like 4 guys in civilian attire driving around in a little sedan, like an Opel. They open up the trunk, quickly assemble their mortar, shoot, and on average our attacks were 3 to 8 rounds. They would pack it up, put it in the trunk,
And drive on.
yeah. Our attacks were very common in the early afternoon, which meant that some of these insurgents were, they're being paid by a group like Al Qaeda in Iraq, and they were basically on their lunch break. I think some of these insurgents were just doing it for the money. Other ones might have been believers in the radical Islamic cause that they thought they were fighting for. So it's very frustrating because we're not used to that. We're used to, if you're in a normal, traditional combat environment, when you get shot at, you move or you re-attack. And we had to basically sit there and take pot shots, not find who was shooting at us, knowing it was going to happen, a few days later. So it was certainly frustrating. Yeah, I'm almost done.
No, it's fine.
Yeah.
Let me stretch.
This is really long. How long have we been here?
I have to check my top screen what time it started.
There's obviously different, it doesn't matter, but there's obviously different formats. I'm sure some guys are going to go, I did this, and then I got off.
No, I mean, this is my first interview, and I basically, you're doing all the talking, you're doing a great job, and I'm just trying to think of things that are on the list here to,
Yeah.
But, that's basically, I think you've covered everything, and, you got what else?
Well, okay, so let me know when you're ready. Yeah. So I came back from Iraq in March of 2005, demobilized in April of 2005, and resumed my reserve career, which was fairly uneventful. I retired as a lieutenant colonel in 2011 after 28 years total service, and of that 28 years, about 13 of it total was active duty. My last job in the reserves, I was an executive officer, or XO, of a detachment of Marines that consisted of about 50 Marines in 30 different sites around the country. I have 7 children, and my 3 older children are either in or joining the military. I think I instilled in my children a sense of patriotism, but also military service, besides being a great way to pay for college. My oldest of 7 and my only son went to the U.S. Naval Academy and he graduated in 2013, commissioned a second lieutenant in the Marine Corps, and is now in Pensacola, Florida, starting flight training. My next oldest is my oldest daughter. By the way, my son's name is Luke. Maybe one day they'll go to the Library of Congress and read this and they'll see their name in there. My oldest daughter, Katie, is in between her sophomore and junior year in college at the University of St. Thomas in St. Paul, Minnesota. And she's on a Navy ROTC scholarship. Navy option, meaning that she will go into the Navy as an officer after she graduates. As we speak, she is on a destroyer in the Western Pacific, Navy ROTC midshipman, do training in the summer, and she's currently on the USS Kidd, KID, which is an Arleigh Burke class destroyer. Arleigh is ARLEIGH Burke, BURKE. So she's on so her hull number is DDG 100, USS Kidd, the two Ds, and then she's an Arleigh Burke class destroyer. So a couple of weeks ago she flew to Singapore, joined up with Kidd in Singapore, and she's now underway. She occasionally sends me messages on Facebook that come in at about 3 in the morning, Minnesota time. And she is on this destroyer for 3 weeks, floating around the Southern Pacific. And at some point, she'll end up in South Korea and then fly home from South Korea. My next oldest daughter, Maria, who just turned 18, just was awarded, she just graduated from high school and was awarded a Navy ROTC scholarship and was accepted into the same unit her older sister's in. And she's going Navy option and will report for training towards the end of August and be a freshman in college next year on Navy ROTC scholarship. And then the rest are too young to know yet what they're doing. So that's it. That's my military career.
Outstanding. I mean, I didn't have to do anything. You were worried about a half hour.
We all?
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you very much. All right, are you with the Sons or with the Sons? Yeah, I'm the state commander.
And so your dad was
Korean War.
Gotcha.
He wounded in NJ Korea and was awarded the Bronze Star Medal. He wasn't wounded when he had action. He was mortared.
Okay.
He was a mortar squadron. He was Army? Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, I know. I never knew about it.
I want somebody walking by to take a picture of the three of us.
I was going to say, I was going to try and get... We can walk back there if we want.
Sir, can you take a picture of us?
Let him come back.
That was fine.
We're good where you can hold this for hours.
Just sit down where we were. Kind of like an action photo. It doesn't have to be far away. Kind of the closer the better. Let's get the three of us in there.
Do you want to go a long way like this or standing
That's like you have it, sir.
Another one?
Please.
Okay, I can get back here, get all the angles in, put the arms. And one more. There we go.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
That's fine.
I'll give you my card if you can. I was just going to say, I'll give you my card. And my dad never talked about it.
Here now, I'm gonna take a selfie with you in the background of her. I don't want the.
Okay.
What is this thing called?
Settle machine.
Settle machine.
See it? Cool. I don't have a card, but forward those to me so I can...
I will.
I mean, if they all want like this, I would do that. You're only me. You need to talk to you. Very good. Held up very well.
Yeah, thank you.
You said you could. You said.
Yeah.
You're all right tonight.
Yeah.
One of my best Marine Corps buddies is from Northbrook, Okay. And when he first